Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's IGC event, which is titled Policies to Address COVID-19's Impact on Africa's Informal Sector. My name is Twivwe Siwale. I am a policy economist at the International Growth Center's London Hub. I am delighted to be moderating today's session. Before we get into it, I just want to share with you a few housekeeping rules that we have set up so that we have a good session. The first thing is that all attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. Secondly, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, we have a section at the bottom of your screen where a Q&A section where you can enter your question. When you do enter a question, it would really be great if you could indicate your full name and organization affiliation. We will have a dedicated time at the end of the discussion to field your questions to the panelists and to get their take on that. So please keep those questions rolling in. We look forward to addressing them. This session is being recorded and will be shared on our website, the IGC website. We are also live streaming on Facebook and our social media pages. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation, please go ahead and you can tweet using the hashtag IGC COVID-19 and the IGC, and we'll be able to follow your tweet. I would also like to mention that we have a brief survey which we would really like you to fill in at the end of the event. We'd like your feedback. We care about what you think, and it will help us bring you content that is useful to you, and it will also help us improve our event. So please take a moment at the end to fill in that survey. I'm not alone. I'm assisted by a group of colleagues from the International Growth Center who will be able to help with technical challenges or anything of that kind. Yeah, so now that we've set the ground rules, we're just going to get into it, and I'll begin by sort of laying the background as to why we thought it was important for us to convene a discussion about COVID-19 policies and the informal sector in Africa. As we are all aware right now, COVID-19 has disrupted the global economy in unprecedented ways. It has erased multiple livelihoods for many people, and it is also threatening the poverty alleviation gains that we've had over the last 20 years on the continent. Africa, like much of the rest of the world, has put in place policy measures to try and forestall the spread of the virus, and these measures have ranged in terms of their stringency. We've seen in some countries very strong policy measures in the form of national lockdowns. Here I'm thinking of countries like Uganda, Rwanda, South Africa, who went into national lockdowns to try and halt the spread of COVID. And then we have, on the other extreme, countries that had a more moderate response. So countries like Mozambique, Zambia, and even further along the line, countries like Tanzania. The particular issue in Africa is that African countries have large informal sectors, and this presents a unique challenge for them in terms of thinking about what policy responses should look like for COVID-19. The International Labour Organization, for instance, estimates that 80% of Africa's workforce lives and functions in the informal economy in one way or the other. And it's important to also note that this is not a homogeneous group, of course. You have domestic workers, you have street hawkers, you have traders, and they all sort of have varying degrees of integration into the formal economy, but by and large they function in the informal sector. And so when you look at those numbers and you look at the measures that have to be taken in order to forestall COVID, it presents a very unique challenge for Africa. And that is why we thought it would be important for us to convene this discussion. One thing I must also mention is that as part of this discussion, we are also launching a policy brief, one of our latest policy briefs that is focused on relationship between informal traders and the state in terms of the social contract that exists between those two groups. The gist of the brief is really that COVID-19, the post-recovery phase, might be an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between the state and informal traders. You can find a link to the brief in the chat section, or you can also find it on our website. If you'd like to access the website, the address is www.bigc.org/COVID-19. And I must mention here that we have a lot of great content on COVID that goes beyond informal workers. And it would be great if you'd look at that website as a resource for understanding what is going on with COVID, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia. With those few remarks, I would like to move on to introduce my panelists, my distinguished panel for today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 questions to each of them, and I'm going to give them 5 minutes to sort of to give us the introductory remarks. But before I do that, let me just walk you through who we have with us, joining us today. So I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our distinguished panel, starting with Minister Babatunde Fashola, who is a Nigerian lawyer and politician who is serving as the Federal Minister of Works and Housing. Minister Fashola served 2 terms as Governor of Lagos State from 2007 to 2015. In 2015, he was appointed by President Buhari to be the Minister of Power, Works and Housing. And in 2019, he was reappointed to be Minister of Works and Housing. Minister Fashola, it's an honor to have you on this panel. Welcome. Right. Next, we also have Hakeem Bishi, who is the Research Project Manager at the Lagos Trader Project. Just a little background about the Lagos Trader Project. It is an academic initiative run by researchers at Stanford University and Dartmouth College. The aim of the project really is to understand the experiences of Nigerian informal traders, and it has been running since 2015. Hakeem himself is a trained urban planner with interests in political economy of the urbanization processes. Welcome, Hakeem.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Sure. Next, we have Danielle Resnick, who is also sitting on the panel and is one of the co-authors on the brief that I mentioned we are launching today. Danielle is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in the Development Strategies and Governance Division. She's a political scientist who focuses on the political economy of development. Welcome, Danielle.
Thanks very much, Twivwe.
Last but not least, we have Niccoló Meriggi, who is my colleague that works from the IGC country office in Sierra Leone. Niccoló has been working in Sierra Leone for close to 5 years now. He has been engaged in advising the government on the implementation of development programs, strategies to evaluate program implementation, and to use the lessons learned from these programs to help the government do that. Welcome, Niccoló, to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Twivwe and the IGC for hosting.
Sure, thank you. So to dig right in, I'm going to go straight to Danielle. Danielle, I'd just like to find out from you, what are some of the COVID-19 policies that African governments have taken to forestall the spread of the virus? In what ways have these policies affected informal traders?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Twivwe. And I think, as is well known, the policies that have been taken are very multifaceted, spanning limits on population movements, restrictions on business operations, health interventions, fiscal and monetary interventions, among many others. And so I'm going to talk about indirect and direct impacts on informal traders. When we talk about informal traders, we are, as Twivwe was mentioning already, we're talking about a subset of the informal economy. And this is a particularly important constituency, both for employment, especially for women, but also for food access for the urban poor. In some cases, the policy interventions that I mentioned across these many different policy spheres have had unintended indirect effects on informal traders. For instance, informal traders who sold food were often considered essential services and businesses and allowed to continue operating. But curfews or transport bans have made it very difficult for them to commute from home to their place of business or to source from their suppliers. And of course, to actually earn an income from consumers who may have been under lockdown conditions. Cross-border traders are a particularly important subset of the informal trader community. And they often face very difficult health implications from COVID due to different policies and testing and tracking across countries that share a neighboring border. This has been a particularly difficult issue for cross-border traders who are operating on the border with Tanzania, which, as Twivwe mentioned, has had a more lax approach towards the COVID pandemic. But then there have, of course, been a number of direct policy responses to either support or in some cases repress the activities of informal traders. And we've detailed some of these in the brief that Twivwe's already alluded to. We also have included some of these in IFPRI's COVID-19 policy response portal. So these responses have ranged from trying to create an enabling environment, trying to disinfect wet markets or open air markets, of course, trying to encourage social distancing and mask wearing. A key approach has been decongesting marketplaces by either moving traders to different locations where there's more space, or as in Ghana, for example, selling alternative products on alternative days. Or as in Mauritius, trying to stagger shopping days so that consumers are not crowded into these marketplaces. In terms of fiscal policy, we've also seen a number of cities have waived fees and other charges levied in markets for a set period. And some, from Ghana to Zambia to Rwanda, have waived charges on mobile money transfers to encourage traders to use contactless payments and therefore not have to deal with cash, which creates a higher risk towards contracting COVID. At worst, though, and at the other end of the spectrum, we've seen some more repressive policies. These tend to have been in more autocratic settings. In Zimbabwe, for instance, we've seen marketeers' stalls having been destroyed and a lot of their merchandise confiscated. In parts of Uganda, we've also seen police and paramilitaries firing live bullets over the heads of traders to try to enforce social distancing rules. Across the board and across many of these countries, even though there has been a more enabling environment for perhaps informal traders operating in stationary, wet, and open air markets, we have seen a rather consistent repressive approach towards street hawkers, who even in normal times outside of COVID have been the most vulnerable and quite highly restricted in their activities. In many countries, they have been more consistently banned due to their inability to wash hands, their transitory nature, engaging with many customers across cities. So Twivwe, I will leave it there. Those are the range of very broad strokes, the range of policies we've seen towards this quite diverse constituency.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That's very, very enlightening. You mentioned physical measures, you mentioned monetary measures, and just the various effects from enabling to restrictive that this has had on these traders. Very quickly, in like a minute, what do these prescriptions, these policy prescriptions, tell us about the social contract that exists between the state and informal traders? What are your main recommendations on how government can sort of strengthen the social contract, especially as we enter a recovery or post-COVID world?
Okay, well, thanks, Twivwe. Well, I think even in normal times, informal traders and the state have had a very fragile social contract. Traders, for example, are a large share of voters in urban areas, and therefore they often cannot be ignored by politicians, especially in more democratic regimes. But I think many of the major mechanisms that are seen as evidence of the social contract, such as citizens paying income taxes and respecting property rights, and then states providing a series of benefits such as pension systems or unemployment benefits or health insurance are often seen as synonymous with formality. Thus, by definition, these are simply just not as strong for informal traders or the informal sector more broadly. In terms of thinking about how to strengthen the social contract with informal traders in a post-COVID world, I think we have to think that at the base of a social contract is trust. Trust that your money will be used appropriately, and trust that the state's monopoly on violence will not be used unjustly or indiscriminately against you. So I think efforts to improve transparency, inclusivity, and accountability are key parts of that. So some things that would be really key are, first, for local governments, to be publicizing how much revenue is collected from markets and from street traders, and how much is reinvested into these markets to improve infrastructure and access to clean water, for example. So this type of budget information you can often find at the national level, but it's much rarer for the municipal or metropolitan level. Secondly, I think revisiting some regulatory frameworks, particularly about street hawkers, is well warranted. And considering, whether it's possible for certain areas of central business districts in African cities to be accessible to them on a more permanent basis, and thinking about certain MOUs that could help formalize these agreements. And then I think finally, broadening cash transfer programs to include informal traders who are often seen as too well off, especially compared to their rural counterparts, to be eligible for such options. And then that they're instead targeted with microcredit or microfinance schemes. And so we can think of ways either through using cash transfer programs or finding ways to incorporate them into existing social safety net programs that are usually targeted to the formal sector. That could be very much a valid way forward. Zambia, for instance, has been experimenting with incorporating informal workers into their national pension scheme in concert with the ILO. So I think those three areas, regulatory frameworks, more transparency about the fees collection and reinvestment, and thinking more broadly about broadening safety nets to informal workers are quite key.
All right, thank you so much, Danielle. That was a very comprehensive set of recommendations. I like the way you said that informal traders are seen as too well off as relative to their rural those who are the rural poor, but at the same time, they are not well off enough to be in the formal sector, sort of leaving them somewhere in the middle. And I think COVID has sort of revealed those, how much of a constraint that is when you have this type of a shock. Well, I'd like to now move on to Minister Fashola and sort of delve into the policymakers' perspective, and which is extremely key, because policymakers really are the decision makers. They're the ones who drive the agenda. And Minister Fashola, Nigeria in many ways is emblematic of the phenomenon of informality. Out of a population of close to 2 million people, over 80% work in the informal sector. This, of course, presents or sort of illustrates the tension that is there in trying to control the spread of COVID, but at the same time ensuring that workers continue to have a livelihood. In terms of in Nigeria, what are some of the measures that have been taken to support people working in the informal economy?
Thank you very much. And I think perhaps the place to start is to first express condolences where appropriate to the entire human community, really, who have become victims of this virus, who have lost their lives, who have lost loved ones, and sympathies to those who have been stricken by the virus and are ill at the moment, and also very thundering applause really to all the frontline workers, health workers, who are valiantly rallying to combat the disease, those we see, and the countless researchers working very, very long hours looking for a cure, a vaccine, and all of that. And I think we couldn't applaud them more. for what they are doing here. And it is important to say this because until we overcome the health problem, we will not have the economy that we want. The global economic structure is essentially predicated on human mobility. And if anyone had any doubt about that, COVID-19 and the inability to move within national borders and across national borders have shown how dependent the entire global economic system is on human mobility. That said, therefore, there is very limited but daily dynamic knowledge about how this virus behaves. And therefore, the science is not complete. And it is the science that dictates what policymakers have to do. And therefore, one of the first things that politicians had to do was everybody just hunker down, lock down for everybody's safety, because safety of lives and property is the first responsibility. And as that began to impact in Nigeria and many other parts of the world, we began to see that jobs were being lost, largely across all sectors, but more impactfully across MSMEs. Checks were falling due, people were being laid off, rent was falling due, and it became necessary then for policymakers to say, hey, this is not working. It's creating a new problem. And in some jurisdictions, you heard people then say, I am hungry. I would rather die of COVID than die of hunger. But there was no choice. So with this background, therefore, one of the things we have done in Nigeria was to deliver a raft of policies, broad, medium, and immediate. One of them was the directive by the president to increase the social intervention program, the Empower, Trader Money, and all of those initiatives that the Buhari administration had launched that had impacted people either with skills or monthly support, or traders, some of whom Danielle had mentioned, hawkers, trading in very, very frugal circumstances, giving them capital to work. The president directed that the numbers of those beneficiaries be increased immediately. But I think that there is another aspect to this. We also saw that in my sector, in construction, for example, we saw that contractors couldn't pay. They couldn't execute, and therefore they couldn't pay their daily unskilled workers who are part of these informal workers. So at the first phase of the ease of the lockdown, we allowed 11 major contractors working in 25 states across 53 projects to return to work. But that meant that we had to recalibrate the health guidelines on the construction site for safety, how they fed, how they cleaned equipment, machines, and all of that. And I can tell you now that it's working. The impact on the economic side is less severe than it was when there was total lockdown. We are also returning to maintenance of roads across 24 states in 92 projects. These are targeted basically at not just keeping the economy going, but particularly at the urban poor, those who live on day-to-day paychecks. They earn between 4,000 to 5,000 naira per day, and it's about $10, $11 per day. But these have helped in no small way to ease the economic pressure. There are a raft of policies by government on the economy at large that would impact all of these people. Payroll support, for example, to private sector, schools, education support, to transport sectors that help to employ many of these people. There's a commitment to healthcare and also tourism sector. So all of these policies are ultimately aimed at ensuring not only the MSMEs and the businesses grow, but they pick people from the lowest rung of the ladder and ease the pain. As you might know, the government also has an economic sustainability plan, which is a 12-month program that, of course, intensifies what we're doing with the budget, but also targets the period of 12 months from July this year to June next year as a way of ensuring that the impact of the health problem on the economy is minimized, and the projections that there will be a recession are well-reasoned projections because of lack of productivity, but we're targeting that it will be a short and sharp recession over 12 months. By 2021, we should be out because of the fiscal and monetary policies we have put in place. There are policies targeted at credit relief for MSMEs through the central bank. Loans are being deferred or renegotiated. Payments on interest, payment on principals have been rescheduled so as to provide some breathing space for businesses. So there's a raft of all of these policies going on. The ultimate impact, of course, will be on the informal sector and informal workers. The last point I wish to make, and this is not government. This is not government. I wish.
Okay. All right. I'll give you 30 seconds to quickly make that point.
I am studying the informal social safety net of Nigeria, and many African countries have this. And they have been very, very impactful in responding to the impact of the COVID on the economy and the informal worker. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing a little bit more about the informal social net. I think it is a very valid point. In some sectors, it's known as sort of coping mechanisms that traders sort of come up with in order to provide themselves with social insurance, and it's a broad area, and I hope we'll have time towards the end to delve in a little bit more. But thank you so much for outlining those policies at the national level, and also for sort of setting what really is a twin challenge: the health pandemic as well as the economic impacts, and how pulling in either direction creates a tension. I'd like to now quickly move to Hakeem, who is well placed to just follow up on some of the things that the minister has highlighted. The minister just walked us through the policy measures that the Nigerian government has put in place in order to help SMEs, as well as just how some of those policies will trickle down to informal sector traders. I know that through your work, you've carried out a panel survey on traders in Nigeria, that you carried out 2 rounds of phone surveys between April and June 2020. And you did this in Lagos State, which had a lockdown from the 26th of March to the 4th of May. And really, I think this provides a great foil for you to sort of share with us some of your findings. Particularly, I'm quite curious to know what happened to the levels of sales and employment since the partial lockdown was lifted on the 4th of May. So, Hakeem, over to you.
We actually had a third wave of the survey, of the phone survey, from the last week of June to the middle of July. So we've been able to update our data since the initial publication of that policy brief. So we have some new data that shows what is happening even since the lockdown has been lifted. So, but I'll start by saying the policy specific to traders in Lagos has to do with a rotational market day system in the city. Basically, This is based on a broad classification of whether it's a food sector, a food market, or a non-food market. So our own traders that we follow and work with fall into the consumer goods sector, and they are the non-food category. Prior to the lockdown and COVID eating everyone, a typical trader in our panel would make about $1,250 per week. That's the average they make every week. But in May, we saw this, during the lockdown, it actually went to almost zero. So there was virtually no income for majority of the traders. And that's basically because they couldn't go to their place of work. In May, this rebounded a bit. It came to about $750 equivalents weekly for an average trader in Lagos. In June, this actually went up a bit to about $995 per week. But even though that looks like it's different, like an increment of over the May figure, this is still substantially lower than what it used to be during this time of the year. As I said, during this time of the year, it would be about $1,250, but in February, sorry to correct, it was about $1,000 in February. So even in February, the figures were lower before COVID hit. So it was in June that it came up to almost 1,000, but still about 1/5 lower than what it used to be. For employment figures, we measured these using 3 variables. We categorize these, one, by traders themselves. How much time do traders now spend in their businesses compared to before now? During the lockdown, it was almost zero. But immediately after the lockdown, a trader would spend, say, about 17 hours in their business. This is compared to about 45 hours prior to the lockdown. So that's significantly, a loss of work time for the traders themselves. Traders typically have 2 categories of workers who work with them in their businesses, and there are the paid workers and the unpaid workers. For the paid workers, typically a paid worker would work about 40 hours in a week in the business, but during the lockdown, it also went down. But immediately after the lockdown was eased, this went up to about 11 hours. But in June, about a month after that was eased, the lockdown was eased, this went up slightly just to about 13 hours. So that still tells you that traders are doing about, the paid workers rather, are doing about 1/3 of what they would normally do. And that this would translate to what they earn also. So that tells you that there is a problem of earning for people who work for these traders themselves. There's also a 3rd category in our employment variable. That's the unpaid workers. The unpaid workers are usually family members of the traders. They are maybe apprentices, but apprentices could be paid or unpaid. But those that are paid, maybe they get paid in support. Some of them would live with the traders. Some of them would get feeding allowances when they work. But that was significantly, almost zero during the lockdown. But this moved up to about 9 hours in February. In May, after the lockdown was eased. Even in June, a month later, it's still way less, because these people ordinarily wouldn't make money. So when they are now working a lot less, even the benefits that comes with their working is almost non-existent. So that's still less than 10 hours that they do on average in a week in June. So that's what we see about employment and Yeah.
Sales and their earnings.
And the revenues, yes, and the sales. That's what we see in the data so far.
Okay, no, excellent. I think that is very, very insightful, especially just the fact that even though the lockdown was lifted, things still haven't gone back to their pre-crisis levels, both revenues and employment. And I like sort of the way you broke it down. I know I have some further questions about how we can address some of the challenges that your study was able to identify, but I think I'm going to sort of ask you in the next section to give us a little more information on that. I quickly want to go to Niccoló, just to build on what Hakeem has outlined for the situation in Nigeria. I mean, data is such an important element in terms of guiding the COVID-19 response, and I think Hakeem's numbers for Nigeria illustrate that very well. But lest we focus solely on Nigeria, I'd also want to find out from Niccoló, from some of the data gathering initiatives that he's involved in Sierra Leone. Yeah, so Sierra Leone had a slightly different approach to the lockdown. They had two national lockdowns, which were fairly short term, from the 5th to the 7th of April and from the 3rd to 5th of May. And they also had a series of restrictions. So Niccoló, I just wanted to hear from you, what changes have you noticed in income of business owners and informal workers? And what are some of the main difficulties that they have encountered due to COVID?
Yeah, Twivwe, thanks for the question, and thanks again, IGC, for organizing, and for the panel, and to the panelists for the useful insight. Surprisingly, despite the differences in policies adopted by the Nigerian and the Sierra Leonean government for addressing COVID, at least I find a lot of similarities in the data from Sierra Leone, between Sierra Leone and Nigeria. Let me start by saying that estimating those effects is really not easy because of the nature of the sector. Unlike the formal sector, or unlike in other countries where you have a good system for recording business transactions, it is not the case for the informal sectors and for a lot of the heterogeneous types of business that compose the informal sector. Another thing that makes the estimation of those effects difficult is that, at least in the beginning of the crisis, things were changing quickly, right? So like what was true, if you had to take a snapshot of what was happening in the Sierra Leone informal sector in February, that was very different from March, and then April, and then May, as the crisis evolved. In Sierra Leone, we have been leveraging on a large database from previous studies to conduct phone surveys amongst like a representative but not entirely balanced sample of the Sierra Leonean population across the entire country, and on a rolling basis. So we've been able to observe a lot of the trends as the crisis evolved. When it comes to businesses in the informal sectors, one of the things that we have been observing is that, in terms of systematic effects, we have observed that dropped in profits and revenues. In fact, there has been a drop of about 50% in profit pre-COVID. So between February and then later in April and May, we observed that the income of a lot of the businesses that we've been serving dropped by about 50%. So I was surprised to hear how much money businesses are making in Nigeria. Yeah. In Sierra Leone, it is much less, because it is true that we are serving mostly rural, informal, small businesses. So very small businesses, sometimes cell phone businesses, but they are making, on a good week, $50. And we have observed that after COVID, the profits, they actually went down close to $20, depending on the business. It's also true that if you think about the way businesses have been impacted by the restrictions and the preventative measures put in place by government, you have to think about what those measures are and what the businesses are. You can think about a trader, by the nature of the business, needs to be mobile. So needs to source products and resell them unless they produce them, right?
Yeah.
So we have been observing that traders have been reporting disproportionate difficulties, both in sourcing the products that then they would sell, but then also because of partly the restrictions in mobility, partly, there have been like some adverse consequences in the economic status of a lot of the consumers. We have recording constantly that one of the main challenges that small business owners face is basically due to lower demand. Again, this is not true throughout the period. Like we've been able to capture, like some interesting statistics to look at are the just before and just after a lockdown. So in Sierra Leone, we had the short lockdowns, and then you see that consumption and also like sales, they actually spike just before the lockdown, as you would expect, and people are running to stock because they are afraid of running out of foodstuff or like indispensable items, essential items during the lockdown. So like it goes well to the point where sometimes like sellers, like kiosk or traders, they run out of their stocks, and then like it drops during lockdown, and then it really struggles to pick up after. The survey that we've been conducting, as I mentioned, has been like on a rolling basis. Around July 20, the president has announced a lift to the inter-district movement restrictions. So that means that now people can move more freely between districts. So technically, traders it should be easier for them to source their products. And also, like there has been delay in the curfew. Now it's not at 9 in the evening anymore, with offices closing at 4, but it's been like announced to be at 11 in the evening, so businesses can operate for a longer period of time. And we are about to update in the statistics to see how this is affecting like different businesses.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Niccoló. That sounds really, really, really interesting. I like the point that you raised, that despite the differences in the length of lockdown in Nigeria and in Sierra Leone, you see similar effects in terms of drops in revenue and even employment, as well as the issue of the fluidity of the situation with COVID. I think that's something that has been particularly striking about this crisis, is that week on week, there are so many things that are changing, and what was true a month ago is no longer true now, and that really affects how policy making can be done, as well as how research and how we should treat findings from research studies. I'd just like to give you all an opportunity, if you would like to respond or to react to something that the other panelist has said that you'd like to either follow up on or highlight more from your own study. I'd just like to give you sort of a minute or two to do that, if you have that, if there are any thoughts that came to you as you were listening to one of your fellow panelists.
So I really like one of the points made by Danielle in terms of she was mentioning that the post-COVID scenario, or the post-COVID state, is actually both a threat and an opportunity, but like she was mostly stressing the fact that it's an opportunity for incorporating informal businesses into the formal sector, and how trust is a critical component of any social contract, right? Then she mentioned that any intervention that could foster trust might enable or might, in a way, like persuade people from the informal sector to eventually join the formal sector. She was mentioning transparency and accountability, and that is definitely something that can increase trust. But in some of the contexts that we operate, which are like definitely like low trust contexts, but also like those are contexts where we might have problems with governance, and sometimes increasing the transparency rather than increasing trust, like should the government not operate properly, might further deteriorate it to the point that it might make the situation even more tense. And it's actually something that I think, like it's worth, like definitely interesting, and also like worth considering in the recommendations made to different policymakers.
Thank you so much, Niccoló. Yeah, that those points certainly resonate. Any of the other panelists want to quickly react to anything else? Yes, Hakeem, I can see your hand is up.
Yeah. So I was going to talk on one of the policy item the Honorable Minister spoke about. That's the Central Bank of Nigeria targeted credit facility for households and MSMEs in Nigeria. It's valued at about 50 billion naira, which is equivalent of about $132 million. It's expected that applicants would have bank accounts and be able to apply, then be pre-qualified and get disbursements on this. But one aspect of it that I'm interested in is the implementation, especially because of the context we work in and the informal sector. I'm aware that there's a great number of traders and more in the informal sector who are unbanked. Also, the ability to maybe apply for this facility themselves online is also limited. So I'm actually of the opinion that a formal method may actually not work well for an informal context. So a context-specific implementation, at least for the portion of that grant that would apply to this group, should maybe be considered and implemented, if not already. I know Lagos State government works a lot with the informal sector, especially bringing them in to the tax net. I'm aware that instead of asking individuals to come pay their income tax or following up with individuals, Lagos State government has perfected a system whereby they go to the market associations, and the market associations gather this income tax, a pre-evaluated amount, I think based on what they sell, which market, I think some agreement is done, or a fixed amount. I'm not so sure what it is. The minister would probably be very familiar with this because it was some of his brainchild while he was the governor. So I know that the state government has really done well to capture this sector into the tax net. So I would expect a system that mimics this in the implementation of social assistance projects like the targeted credit facility. So for it to have an effective outcome with regard to the informal sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakeem. I think I'm going to give the minister a chance to maybe respond to that.
Okay, quickly. Thank you, Twivwe. Hakeem raised an important point, but I don't think that it is something to panic about. First, to say that one of the important positive results, if you like, for the African economy and the global economy as we go forward from this is that a lot more data will be available in the foreseeable future. People who chose to be anonymous in different sectors of the economy now are realizing that you can't get help if we can't find you. And I believe that one of the things that either the conditional cash grants that the administration initiated well before COVID, since 2015, as the social intervention program, well before COVID, was to ensure that everybody who participated got an identity, a registration, data was collected, and there will be no going back on that. And data is increasingly being collected in Nigeria and many African countries. And for the most vulnerable people that Hakeem has alluded to, market women, the truth is that whether we like it or not, they are already identifiable because they have a cell phone. And each cell phone has a subscriber identity module. And it is important now to put that into a collectible form, if that would be the identification. They are receiving money internationally, locally, diaspora remittances through their telephone. So we shouldn't worry about this. Now, the last point to make, we should be concerned, of course, but I don't think it's something to worry about. They are more adaptive, more flexible, and more intelligent than we give them credit for. And it's important to just lay the parameters of performance bare. And that speaks to some of the things that Daniela perhaps alluded to. What are the bolts and nuts of the social contract? How does it play? The last point on this matter again is that I was privileged to sit in the Economic Sustainability Committee under the chairmanship of the Vice President. I was chairman of the subcommittee to write the rules for the reopening of the markets. I was also chairman of the subcommittee to advise government on implementation of the cost of the broadband. And so some of these things were matters of extensive hours of debate, consultation with interest groups. For example, barbers, salon operators, masseurs, cosmeticians who wanted to reopen, and we met with them. So we are interfacing with them. That's the point I want to make. We are not prescribing implementation top down. We have a policy. Now, who are the champions of different sectors? And the point you make about the the unregistered one, don't forget there are two tracks of this. There's the Empower SIP trader money track. And that is still running and it has been expanded. And there is now the special COVID intervention that we talked about. So we're talking to champions of different sectors to participate in advising us who are their most vulnerable members, who are their most affected members, and what should we give? Should we give payroll support? Should we give rent support? Should we give loan remission, interest remission, and all of that? It is what they prescribe that we will then implement. So it may actually be more than the amount, but that is the first start to see how that works.
Thank you so much, Minister Fashola. You've comprehensively answered the question. I am shortly going to turn to our audience who have sent through a couple of questions. But before we do, I just quickly want to touch base with Danielle on just one issue, which the minister two issues really that the minister alluded to. One is women, the issue of we know that disproportionately the informal sector is made up of women. What are the effects on women? How should we think about women in this context? And the second is the issue of innovations in technology. The minister mentioned that these informal traders are not entirely unknowns. They have mobile phones, that information is there. What are some of the innovations that you seeing coming up which can assist in terms of addressing the challenges with informal sector workers?
Okay, thanks, Twivwe. So I'll try to be brief. I'll start with your second question first about innovations in technology. And I think the use of mobile money has been one of the major innovations, as the minister was alluding to as well, that we've seen. And I think this is an area that still has a lot of potential in terms of allowing traders to use their phones to pay their stall fees or their operating licenses to municipal and metropolitan tax collectors. Also using these to pay for food safety licenses, for example. I think this would be, developing this in more detail is really key to improving the revenue of local governments who often don't have enough staff to collect these fees. And I think also reducing the exposure of traders to attempted bribes, by local level officials. Actually having receipts that they can show on their through some type of phone platform that shows they've already paid fees. I think also, like, just as there's been innovations using WhatsApp for improving agricultural extension for farmers, similar approaches could be used to educate traders about appropriate food safety measures, since we know kind of food safety, hygiene issues are really key to this public health pandemic and other issues we've seen in markets around cholera and typhoid. And I think even though we do need to be conscientious that while technology is being touted in many domains, it involves more than just creating an application. It involves a whole suite of investments, including around digital literacy, especially for older or less well-educated informal workers, as well as digital privacy. So, that people feel safe, that even if, the government knows their phone number or knows what type of transfers they're doing, that some of this information will be safe. And that involves a whole suite of regulations and investments beyond just, creating a useful application. And then your second question on gender. Well, there's a whole suite of scholarship on how to make social protection systems more gender sensitive, though I think less well developed, specifically focusing on the informal sector. But I think one key thing is recognizing, just as in the formal sector and the informal sector, you can have occupations be quite gendered. So making sure any type of eligibility criteria takes that into account in a way that doesn't exclude women. So for instance, we find from many of our surveys across the region that women are typically concentrated in the sale of fresh vegetables and fruits in wet markets, but they predominantly can do so from tables, from pavements, from an umbrella setup, and not necessarily always from an established storefront or stall. So you would not want to establish a cash transfer program that uses having a stall or storefront as a criteria for eligibility. You'd also want to make sure that the provisions for accessing any type of in-kind or cash transfer are very clear, very easy to access. As something else we found from our survey work is that there are quite strong educational differences between men and women who work in the markets, with women unfortunately having lower levels of literacy or education. So I think at least thinking about those two aspects on eligibility criteria is quite key.
Okay. Thank you so much, Danielle. That's really, really useful. I would like to now turn to our audience who've been listening in and have sent in quite a number of questions. Thank you to everybody who has submitted. And yeah, I just quickly want to begin with, we've received a question from Abdul Fatia Anofi, who wants to ask the minister, how do we reconcile the various interventions in support of the small, medium, and micro enterprises with data collection challenges, especially when a larger percentage of the participants in the informal sector are not documented? I think the minister sort of touched on this already. He mentioned that quite a number of them are documented, but I want to tie it with Abdullah Fati's second question, which is a question about looking beyond COVID-19. As we look beyond COVID-19, can we envisage other societal challenges with potentially similar adverse impacts as the pandemic? How do we create a holistic policy to the informal sector? Yeah, so I think that's the question that I'll be putting to our panelists, which is sort of the post-recovery phase of COVID. As we look to beyond this pandemic, what are some of the, and I think Danielle has already sort of touched on this, how do we look at the informal sector in a more holistic way? I don't know, Minister, if you want to touch on that, as this was sort of directed towards you.
Okay, as I said before, there are emerging ways of identifying the informal sector. And let me share my own experience, some of my experiences. On one of our construction sites in Abuja, I met two young laborers from different parts of Nigeria. One was from Taraba in the northeast part of Nigeria, and one was from Ekiti in the southwest of Nigeria. They were on a site in Abuja in the north central at a construction site where we were building 700 plus houses. And when I interacted with them and asked them how they found out the site, they told me that they were using WhatsApp to inform themselves where there is work, and they travel there. So, and that's why I said they're not as stupid as we think, or as helpless as we think that they are. Then, and I say this also because at subnational level, our government worked with Hernando de Soto, and we did a lot of studying of informal sectors. And one of the things we found out is that it's not that they don't have records. They keep records among themselves in their unions, in their cooperatives, in their informal arrangement. They have ID cards. They enter records. So the challenge of government is how to make that record responsive to the way we collect data. That really is it. And perhaps that goes back to the issue of trust that Daniela has harped upon, and the social contract. And I think this is an epochal moment, really, for them to now realize that, look, we need to be identifiable if we are going to be protected in the long run by the government we vote for, who collect taxes. Because even in that informal sector, as Bishi said, we found a way of collecting taxes from them at the subnational level. So I think it's an ongoing conversation, but people are responding. That is a positive thing. And the more digital your society is, the more easy it will be to collect data as we all go on. And we will find a universe where nobody can, in the event, become anonymous anymore. In terms of similar challenges going forward post-COVID, I hope there will be no challenge of this similarity going forward in the near term. I know that we had Ebola a few years ago, but it paled into insignificance compared to this. I am optimistic that what human beings do if they have been denied an opportunity is that they try to catch up. So I'm optimistic that as we overcome the disease, people will catch up on lost time. Productivity perhaps will double, prices will spike, there will be potentially some economic bonanza as things near normalcy in many sectors. Perhaps some of the travel-based tourism sectors may be the last to pick up, but I'm optimistic that economies will essentially normalize because people will try to catch up on what they couldn't do in Q1 and Q2 or Q3. That's the human behavior.
All right, thank you so much. I have another question here from Rob Akril from the from Nottingham Trent University. And I'd like to direct this to Hakeem, so just as well that your hand is up. Reference has been made to the ways in which different countries have been trying to reduce the density of crowds in markets. But what evidence is there that these measures have been followed and have been successful? Is the wearing of face coverings a part of these measures? I think, Hakeem, your survey did look at some of these issues, so I'd like to give that one to you very quickly in like 45 seconds.
Yeah, so our data supported a positive trend in terms of compliance with public health regulations. Market executives took it upon themselves to implement these, and there were also the presence of government officials around in collaboration with the market executives to make sure that these are actually complied with. So mask wearing is a major one in the markets. Also, there are hand washing stations that are provided. But in terms of the crowd, it's maybe difficult to control, especially when these are open markets or markets that do not have gates or boundaries or whatever. They are all within the city centers. So, but mask wearing, hand washing, which are mostly provided at the individual trader level, they have buckets with soap and water in their shops, and as well as sanitizer, which is a very popular cleaning option for traders. But our data didn't support maybe I didn't support that people ignored this regulation. It actually, on the contrary, showed a very high compliance level with public health safety regulations.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much for that. We have only a few minutes to go, and I sort of want to address some questions that we've received from slightly south of the equator. We have Benjamin Chibuye, who is asking Danielle, in the case of Zambia, what is your impression of the degree to which policies implemented by authorities to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 have been helpful to the informal sector? Any thoughts on what additional policies can be specifically tailored to and implemented to support the informal sector? I think Danielle has already begun to touch on this. I'd like to pair it with another question on Zambia, which is coming from Brenda Mwenya. Are there any programs focused on educating the informal sector in terms of use of technology, especially elderly women in Zambia? So very quickly, in about a minute, Danielle.
Okay, well, thanks for those Zambia focused questions. So Zambia did not take, compared as Twivwe said at the outset, it did not take as strong a position in terms of the degree of restrictions on businesses as some other countries did. The mayor of Lusaka originally said they were going to clamp down on street hawkers, but I believe after a few weeks they realized that was quite difficult to do, and that provision was reduced. And in terms of the actual markets, I think a key thing has been what we talked about already was, bringing in hand washing stations and having masks. The degree to which, traders have complied, I'm not sure, not being on the ground there, and perhaps some of the audience members who perhaps are based there will have a better idea of that. But I do know there has been, certainly less repression in markets there than we have seen in other parts of the continent, such as in Zimbabwe or Uganda, as I mentioned. I think in terms of digital literacy for women, particularly older women, well, for this, I know that the government was attempting to team up with a few of the mobile phone providers to try to push forward mobile payments for local taxes, stall fees, and licenses, as I mentioned earlier. And from other work that we did for the IGC surveying receptivity of traders to doing this, we did find that there was a big gap between men and women, and particularly more and less well-educated women. And that definitely was correlated with age. And it was simply, I think, a big thing between older women, being less likely to use mobile payments for other things, like their TV bills or their water charges. And so there's an instance of the more you're familiar with doing this in other areas of your life, the more receptive you might be doing this to your work in the informal sector. But I'm personally not sure how much additional training or outreach the government or mobile phone providers have done for this, though I do know some of the marketeer associations have been quite vocal in terms of pushing this type of technology forward to change the way taxes are collected there.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who submitted a question. Unfortunately, due to the limitations with time, we're not really going to be able to address all of your questions. In the last few minutes, I just want to give each one of our panelists the opportunity to just give us some very brief concluding remarks. If you can quickly sum it up in one recommendation going forward, that would be excellent. But I would really like it to be short and spiffy. And I'm going to start with Niccoló, as in what's
Thank you, Twivwe.
Yeah.
No, so actually, I wanted to intervene at some point, and I really like the questions from Mr. Enofi asking about like what shall we do in the aftermath of COVID? It seems like, if anything, COVID has been another wake-up call, telling us, like we need to address the informal sector because there are a lot of vulnerabilities related to not being, on any of the records, especially when like other questions are asking about, okay, how do we address like people from the informal sector with different packages? I think this is just a confirmation that there needs to be some systematic work in, if anything else, leveraging on the type of solutions that Minister Fashola was mentioning. Like we know that there are records from organizations of street vendors. Why don't we include them in the government records before a crisis starts? Why do we need to wait until there is an urgent and absolute need to have them on record? So again, I guess the message is just like fortune cookie wisdom, which is like, don't let a crisis or a good crisis go to waste. There is a wake-up call, like, it's again reminding us the things that need to be done. They need to be done in the downtime as opposed to the crunch time.
Excellent.
That would be my...
Great. Thank you so much, Niccoló. Yeah, don't let a good crisis go to waste. That is, I like how snappy it is. I'll move on to the Minister. Minister Fashola, your final remarks in 30 seconds.
Well, I think all I would like to say is that our collective prosperity depends on our mobility. And therefore, everybody must do whatever they can to help contain the spread of the disease and to help us defeat the virus. That is when we can really have the economy and the prosperity that we desire. I would like to use the opportunity to ask Bishi and Niccoló if they can share the results of those surveys. I am curious if something they're able to share. I would be glad if they can send it through Laura to me.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mobility is responsible for our collective prosperity. Another tweetable moment. I'll move on to Hakeem very quickly. 30 seconds, final words, and that you must share your findings with the minister. But yeah, 30 seconds.
So definitely we can share the data. I just need to check with the other PIs on the project, but I think it's not impossible. One of the objectives of the project is to influence policies. So I think IGC is aware of that, so we can share the data. As a final point, there are two things that I would mention, which we noticed. One supports, I think in general, supports the Honorable Minister's remark that we give less credit to people in the informal sector than they actually deserve. And that is really true. And our data supports that as well. Basically, we asked what coping mechanisms traders used during the lockdown, during the time when they were unable to make any income. And you'll be surprised that about 15% of our traders actually told us that they consider their business still in operation. How were they making that? They had to innovate. Some had to use social media. Some had to use a different kind of home delivery method to make sure they get income. Another thing they did was that they relied on their social group, a network, including hometown and ethnic group, church groups, a lot of social groups that they belong to. They actually relied on that. They fell back on those groups to actually get some kind of support. So I would say that going forward, we should go back a bit and interrogate how these people or humanity generally coped with this crisis. If we go back a bit to interrogate, we might actually get insight into how we can do better going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Hakeem. And finally, Danielle, we are slightly over, but within the next 30 seconds, just your final comment.
Okay. Well, first I'd say, I mean, the immediate kind of reaction is that we can't do any harm or do no harm. So destroying market stalls or confiscating merchandise of informal traders certainly does not help their livelihoods or recovering after the pandemic. Secondly, I think, as we've heard today, traders are a heterogeneous constituency in many ways and with many distinct interests. And some of whom want less regulation and oversight by the state, others would like greater incorporation into safety net programs. Some are successful entrepreneurs and some are hovering on the precipice of destitution. So when we're thinking about social protection coverage, we really need to think creatively about these different nuances. At a very difficult time when we're seeing reduced fiscal space for African governments to support such social safety net programs. And lastly, as Niccoló was already saying, this is an extraordinary period. It reveals many of the systemic weaknesses we knew already existed between the state and informal workers. And so I think a critical step going forward that has been critical even before the pandemic is investing in improving infrastructure in wet markets and open markets. This would have avoided the need to shut down some of the markets if they had been properly socially distanced to begin with and had proper water and sanitation. It's definitely not easy. It's certainly contentious, but it's definitely necessary, and it really cannot just be left to often cash-strapped local governments.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Danielle. Nuances is very key. Yeah, I'd just like to thank all of my panelists for this, for all their contributions, all the insights, all the thoughts that they've shared with us. It's really, truly been an amazing webinar, and I've learned so much. I'd also like to thank the audience who sat through, and my apologies that we've gone a little bit over by about 5 minutes. But yeah, thank you so much for joining this session. And as I said earlier, if you could quickly fill in the survey that we have, as well as go over to our website if you'd like to read the full brief, which is available. Thank you, everyone, and bye.